What I'm about to talk about now is known as the culture of poverty. This actually harks back to the man who has been kind enough to do this filming on my behalf, and that's Jim Hamilton. Jim and I both worked with First Nations communities for a number of years. Several years ago, he and I entered into some discussions about this concept of a culture of poverty and how it hardly fit the actions that we were seeing across Native communities. There was a widespread ability, consciousness among across these communities, and an eagerness to seize advantage to succeed. This very dangerous theory, right, is simply not supportable. It wasn't supportable in my experiences in Jamaica and what I recorded there any more than it was across the First Nations of New Brunswick. The reason I think it's still worth dealing with is because it has never stopped resurfacing. I read it in one form or another in analyses today, in the popular press. I hear it in TV broadcasts and analyses, in various forms. It doesn't go by this name necessarily, but it has a sinister ability to endure, despite all evidence to the contrary, right? Not to mention just the whole gamut of human history itself. I have a great crib sheet here that I was able to get off of Wikipedia. I'm going to draw on that and try to relate it at least to my fieldwork and to what I wrote in my book. The culture of poverty is a social theory that expands on the cycle of poverty. It attracted academic and policy attention in the 1960s, survived harsh academic criticism, and made a comeback at the beginning of the 21st century. It offers one way to explain why poverty exists, despite anti-poverty programs. Early proponents of this theory argued that the poor are not simply lacking resources, but also acquire a poverty-perpetuating value system. According to anthropologist Oscar Lewis, and this is a quote, the subculture of the poor developed mechanisms that tends to perpetuate it, especially because of what happens to the worldview, aspirations, and character of the children who grow up with it. Okay, so this becomes an intergenerational thing, right? Which of course then gives it a permanence over time if this is something that's constantly being transmitted culturally. Okay, in other words, there's no exit from this stuff. The people in the culture of poverty have a strong feeling of marginality, of helplessness, of dependency, of not belonging. They are like aliens in their own country, convinced that the existing institutions do not serve their interests and needs. Along with this feeling of powerlessness is a widespread feeling of inferiority, of personal unworthiness. The culture of poverty concept proved attractive to U.S. public policy makers and politicians. It strongly informed documents such as the Moynihan Report in 1965 and the War on Poverty more generally. This is a very dangerous business when you have a war on poverty and yet you've already accepted on a set of underlying assumptions, essentially, that what? The poor can't help themselves. The poor are poor, well, maybe initially because of these external forces that made them poor, but once they become poor, right, they're incapable of change, in other words. This is what's doomed these programs from the beginning. You would end up with a position that would say something like, well, geez, God knows we've tried to give them this, we've tried to do that, we've tried everything else, etc., but, it's in their heads, we just can't shake it out of them. It's in their culture. It almost takes on a kind of a genetic dimension to it in terms of the power of its influence on behavior. And that's the danger of it, because what? It takes everybody else off the hook. Right? It blames them for their own misery. When I relate this to my experience in Jamaica, and notably in my book, the main character in particular, But I don't want to just stick with him because his his actions, his beliefs, his actions, his motivations, um, his personality, I could argue, right? His culture, his values, his attitudes, etc., were at one level widespread, shared on a widespread basis across all of the people I knew in that community and the island generally. These were hardly people who shared any kind of widespread feeling of inferiority. Okay, they most definitely shared a widespread feeling of powerlessness. It's one thing to be powerless, right? It's another thing, okay, to feel that what your powerlessness is owing not simply to the conditions that are forced upon you, but also to your own inferiority, right? And to, more pointedly, as he puts it, personal unworthiness. Nobody there felt they were unworthy where I worked in Jamaica. These people were intensely conscious of the forces that had been raised against them, that continued to, as they put it, hold them down. The main character in the book could not be in any possible way, right, depicted as or characterized as a man with an inferiority complex, number one, or number two, with any sense whatsoever of personal unworthiness. This is a man who came up as a bastard child, hated by his father, actually hung by him at one point when he was 12 years old. Just an extraordinary story. A two-time loser, had been, basically forced to go to Kingston and emigrate with all the other rural poor as a young man, to live in these filthy slums of Backawal, to become ultimately a gang leader, which was an achievement in itself. Then to, as it turned out, end up spending 7 years in two of the island's penitentiaries. First work he did when he came back to his home area was to sell peanuts on the beach. That's all he could do to make a living, right? And then he started selling ganja, right? And then the story went on from there. But this was a man who had a sense of determination, of conviction, of toughness, of durability, of fearlessness, of every possible characteristic that would be the opposite of Lewis's general depictions of what he should have been like. He not only makes it, but this is a guy who never stopped believing that he would succeed, okay? Right? Throughout the time I knew him, right? Despite all the odds against him. That was the most staggering thing to me about him, right? Was that he just was not, that famous line he once said to me, "I gone rich or I gone dead," right? It was going to, he was going to either make it or he was going to, he was going to die trying. Now, how could anybody, right, use a concept like the culture of poverty to explain that individual alone? But what I'm trying to emphasize here is the fact that this wasn't just him. This was true of the whole society, I'm going to call it that. They were aware that what? The big men and the property men and the big jinals, the politicians, right? Okay, right? Had fucked them, okay? And were constantly, right, exploiting them. There wasn't a day that went by that I didn't hear that from them. They were very aware of the reasons they were poor, okay? They were very aware of why the opportunities that they had were so restricted, whether it was to gain access to land, to grow some food, right? Whether it was to be able to go out to sea, whether it was to be able to get contract work abroad where you had to go through the politicians and kiss their ass, right, and vote the right way in order to get a card, as they called it, right, whether it was to get your kid in school, right, into high school, whatever it was. This was the history of Jamaica, and this is what I also dealt with in the book, where you have these amazing developments that occurred in Kingston, where ultimately politicians, right, create criminal gangs, okay, to control political wards, to get the vote out for them, right, and then allow these guys as well to take over the drug trade. This is what caused poverty in these places. It's time to just erase this thing, right? It's time to just stop this kind of thinking. It has a kind of a way, an insidious way of being believable and of allowing people, of course, right, to those who are among the more privileged or the more lucky, those who aren't poor, okay, to be able to say, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, well, I guess there's not much we can really do for these poor bastards, right? It's a shame, right? But, they're just fucked.